Okay. Also, what Romeo and Juliet are doing also is they're forming a kind of traditional poetry together, because birds are a famous subject of multiple poems. John Keats has a very famous poem to the nightingale. My heart aches and a drowsy numbness paints my senses, though of hemlock I have drunk, or emptied some dull opiate to the drains 1 minute past, and leftwards it sunk. Edgar Allan Poe has a very famous poem about the raven. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, suddenly there came a rapping as of someone gently tapping. It's, anyway, so it's a famous subject. There's hundreds of famous poems. Maybe not that many, but there's a lot of poems about birds, because it was thought that birds were kind of messengers to the gods. And they flew up to heaven, and so they're like a very famous subject. There's famous poems about skylarks. Thomas Hardy has a great poem about, I can't remember the name of the bird. Is thrush the name of a bird? I can't remember. I'm not really good with fucking birds. But anyway, it's a lot of poetry about birds. And so Romeo and Juliet composing this, they're talking about, is it a lark, is it a nightingale? They are essentially composing poetry. And they've even picked a traditional subject to talk about, which are the birds like nightingales and larks, which are extremely famous for this kinds of things. So cool. How are you, Maureen?
I'm good.
Guys, we've been joined by Maureen.
Hey guys.
Talking about love. Guys, there's the woman that I love. It is the East, and Maureen is the sun. See? All right. Yeah. She's even wearing yellow. Come. And we have special flowers also, which is really nice. That's also I was pointing out, birds are a traditional subject for poetry. So are flowers, particularly lilacs, which were known in the ancient world as syringia. And it was associated with Orpheus, who in ancient mythology lost his wife Eurydice, who he went down to the underworld to get. And I forget why lilacs are associated with him, but they are. Okay, how are you?
Also, there are male and female lilacs, and I think they often fertilize each other.
See, this is the problem: is that everything I know about flowers comes from poetry. So if it's not a poem, I don't know. Also, I mean, hyacinths. I've read so many poems about hyacinths, and I swear to God, if you took me to a flower store, I couldn't recognize the hyacinth. I don't know which one's which.
They're really potent. You can really smell them.
I don't know. I don't know much about flowers.
Hey guys.
Yeah.
Do you want food?
Yeah, sure. I'd love food.
Yeah.
Food's great.
Okay. All right. I'm gonna make some food.
Maybe just like a yogurt bowl, something easy. Yeah.
All right.
All right.
Be ready in like a couple minutes.
Thank you. All right. So Romeo and Juliet are composing poetry together on a traditional topic, which is it associates them with the ancient world and all these kinds of bigger, more important movements of things. Okay, so at the top of page 2, Juliet, and the conversation between Romeo and Juliet is essentially, he says, "Okay, sun's up, I gotta go." She says, "No, it's not. Maybe it's something else. Maybe it's not the sun. Maybe it's like a meteor or something, and you should stay." And he says, "You know what? I love you. If you want me to stay, I'll stay here, even though it means I'm going to be put to death." At which point she changes her mind and says, "You know what? It actually is the lark. It is the morning. You do have to go." And she's irritated with the lark. She says, "Some say the lark makes sweet division." Division has two meanings here. Division in music is the different notes that it makes, but division also can mean to divide two people, to separate them. "Some say the lark makes sweet division. This doth not so, for she divideth us. Some say the lark and loathed toad changed eyes. Oh, now I would they had changed voices too, since arm from arm that voice doth us defray. Hunting me hence with hunts up to the day. Oh, now be gone. More light and light it grows. More light and light, more dark and dark our woes." Remember when he started, Romeo was talking about all those contraries, like bright smoke and, all those, I forget, he had a whole bunch of cold fire. He said love is involved. They're paradoxes and ironies. And just love is hard to describe because it's both heavy and light. You can see them doing it together right here, where she says, "More light and light it grows." But of course, if the light is up, it means Romeo has to go. And so the paradox is, more light and light, more dark and dark our woes. Meaning the lighter the sky gets, the darker we feel, because it means I have to leave. So it's a beautifully composed sort of movement of poetry that they're writing together. And it's really one of my favorite things about the play. Is one way to think about Romeo and Juliet. I know everybody just thinks of them as bratty, horny teenagers, but one way to think about Romeo and Juliet is they do kind of, they're soulmates and they share a soul, and they use that shared soul to compose poetry. And it's beautiful poetry, and it's really just wonderful. And I know my students are just like, "Oh, nerds," but I don't know. I think there's something great about it. But I'm also like I don't know. Love. It's a good thing, right? I'm not gonna. All right, whatever. Um, and then the nurse comes in and interrupts them, and they have to leave, and they have to kind of split for each other, and that's the end of that. Okay, cool. So we're racing on here towards the end of the play, and I don't have a whole lot of other things I really want to go into here, but we're going pretty good. So let's see where else I'm headed to next. Okay. Let's talk about this incredibly depressing moment in the play. It's again not the death, actually. What's really sad is before the death. I'm on page 21 here. Um, Juliet's parents tell her she has to marry this guy Paris. Now, if you've seen the movie, Paris is this dork that wants to marry her, and he makes a deal with her dad. Her dad is essentially forcing her to marry someone. This is pretty typical. Families at the time would often make these kinds of arranged matches for their children. Not always, but it did happen, and Juliet's father has made an arranged match. He wants her to marry Paris. He's discussed it with Paris, and he's decided to essentially make her marry Paris. That's like a good, because it's going to connect the families, and it'll give them more power as sharing wealth and all these kind of one family now. It's sort of like a corporate expansion. And then Juliet says she won't marry Paris, and then she gets in a huge fight with her father, who sort of demands. He really becomes an awful fucking monster at that point. The way that he treats her is just disgusting. He says, like, "How dare you defy me? You're my property, and if you don't do this, I will throw you out on the street and say I have no daughter." It's a really horrible. He's really terrible to her. He says, "Go hang thee, young baggage, you disobedient wretch. You disobedient wretch. I tell thee what, get thee to church on Thursday, or never after look me in the face. Speak not, reply not, do not answer me." And he's so angry about it, he can't even speak. But the really crushingly depressing part is what happens next. Her father is so angry. He literally says to her, "You are mine." I'll show you the lines. I'm on 21, top of 21. He says, that's so sad. He says to her, "And you be mine, I'll give you to my friend. And you be not, hang, beg, starve, die in the streets. For by my soul I'll ne'er acknowledge thee, nor what is mine shall ever do thee good. Trust to it, bethink you I'll not be forsworn." So he's really forcing her to marry this guy. And the mother won't help at all, and they leave. And Juliet turns to the nurse for help. And this is really one of the most crushing moments in the play. She says, "Oh, nurse, how shall this be prevented? My husband is on earth, my faith in heaven. How shall that faith return again to earth unless that husband sent it me from heaven by leaving earth? Comfort me, counsel me." She's asking the nurse for comfort and counsel. Because remember, she's secretly married Romeo, but the family doesn't know. She's just had her wedding night. Romeo just snuck out the window like 30 seconds earlier. And she says to the nurse, "Comfort me, counsel me." And the nurse says this. Terrible. The nurse says, "Look, here it is. Romeo is banished, and all the world to nothing that he dares come back to challenge you, or if he do, it must needs be by stealth. Right? He can't come back, or he's got to sneak in. Then since the case stands as it doth, I think it best you married with the county," that's Paris. "Oh, he's a lovely gentleman. Romeo's a dishclout to him. An eagle, madam, hath not so green, so quick, so fair an eye as Paris hath. Beshrew my very heart, I think you are happy in this second match, for it excels your first. Or if it did not, your first is dead, because Romeo's pretty much dead, because he's banished, and if he comes back to the city, he'll be killed. As 'twere as good he were as living here, and you no use to him." Juliet says, "Speakest thou from thy heart?" And the nurse says, "And from my soul too." Amen. What? She says, "You have comforted me marvelous much." The nurse is saying something pretty awful here. The nurse is like, "Look, I know you married Romeo," because the nurse helped her marry Romeo. The nurse says, "Look, I know you married Romeo, but he's banished, so, that's over. Marry this new guy." Juliet is already married. But the nurse is a practical person who doesn't care about love, and she just looks at it as, look, Romeo's banished, so that relationship's not going to work out, so marry this other guy. For starters, if you're a religious person, or even a person who cares about the law, she's asking her to do something that is both sinful and illegal, which is to be married to two men at the same time. The nurse doesn't give a shit. The nurse is a practical person. And at this moment, the nurse counsels her, forget about Romeo. That guy's pretty much dead because he's banished. Marry this other guy. He's pretty good and he's rich. It doesn't seem like the same kind of seriousness, but please notice that Romeo loses Mercutio in the battle with Tybalt, so that his main advisor dies. And Juliet loses the nurse at this moment, because the nurse is like, Romeo, he's banished, fuck him, marry this new guy. Now the two kids no longer have anyone to go to for help except for Friar Lawrence. All right, see you in the next video.